This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
National Defense does not have a great reputation when it comes down to transparency. The Ethics Commissioner, or the Information Commissioner in the past, has criticized National Defense as being one of the worst offenders of leaving things outstanding. The stories around Vice Admiral Mark Norman and that the code names were used instead of his name by National Defense to hide all memos and correspondence relating to the Mark Norman affair were done and critiqued and criticized. We know that with former Chief of Defense Staff John Vance that there was questions around the transparency and cover-up that happened there for a few years of the department knowing, the minister knowing at that time that there was complaints against the former general. So I'm looking at the report on the administration of the Privacy Act by National Defense. And I'm looking at page 9, figure 7. 1 year is completely missing, 2019-2020. Was there nothing in that year, or was that a typo or an error, and what's the number that should be in there?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. If I may, I'm going to turn to officials. I don't have that report open in front of me.
It's your most recent report. Bill?
Yes.
Mr. Matthews?
I will come back and confirm the numbers. My recollection, Mr. Chair, is ATIP responses during COVID period, let's just say the service standards deteriorated, and so I will come back with official numbers, but I know during COVID there...
So when I look at figure 7, I look at 2019, or earlier, there's 3 outstanding requests as of March 2023. Is that number accurate? Minister, but Deputy Minister?
Thank you. I'm tracking 5 now, but again, date timestamp, so I'm tracking 5 that are late. So cannot speak to its accuracy at that time. I'm now tracking
official
5.
report from the department, Minister, and so I know for a fact that just myself, that I've got 4 outstanding ATIPs from before that time. Got one filed back on October 13, 2017, one on October 4th, 2018, another one January 24th, 2019, another one March 6th, 2019, 4 right there that your department is aware of and finally got back to me with, we're still working on it. Why have these ATIPs been allowed to go this long when the Act says 30 days? Is this political obstruction? Because it comes from the Shadow Minister of Defense.
Shall I take that?
Minister, I put it to you. It's your department. When you were minister under public safety, RCMP and CBSA didn't have a great track record on transparency either. So what are you doing to rectify?
Well, and we worked hard while I was in public safety to improve that record and improve the transparency, as I've acknowledged in my opening remarks. I think there remains work to do, and I've talked a little bit about the processes that are underway. Unfortunately, I don't have available to me sitting here in front of you the information about those ATIPs. I'll happily look into the status of yours in particular, because I believe, first of all, every Canadian has a right to timely access to that information if it's available to be provided.
But this actually speaks to our democracy. When any of us as parliamentarians are asking the ministry for this information, like I'm talking about, correspondence around national shipbuilding strategy. We're talking about some hospitality records. The correspondence around Canada's fighter force and the future of the F-18s. These are all, talking about cyclones. These are all things that us as parliamentarians need to do our jobs here at committee, in the House, and working with our constituents and stakeholders. So why would this be blocked and no response ever provided?
Well, again, I don't believe it should be blocked. I think that information, if it's available, should be made available to you as quickly as possible, and certainly within the timelines that are required under statute. Frankly, I don't disagree that in your responsibilities as a parliamentarian, the access to that information, I know my office deals with a number of OPQs that we receive from you, and we work very hard to make sure that we respond to those in a timely way. But if you've made those applications through the ATIP process, I'll happily go back and review each one of those if you would provide me with that information.
We'll
get you answers as quickly as possible. Oh, that would be very helpvel. I'd appreciate it if you'd provide it to me, and we'll look right into all of those.
We'll do that because it doesn't smell good when, parliamentarians are asking the ministry for information, not getting that information, not allowing us to do the work that we do up here in making sure that policies and programs and legislation are being properly implemented. And, we do talk about obstruction of justice, we talk about obstruction of information, we talk about obstruction of officers up here like the Information Commissioner that has criminality tied to it. So if I took these complaints directly to the office of the Commissioner, would she be able to get these results because the department has failed?
Well, you've made reference to the ministry. Those actually don't come to my office. They go to both the D&D and to CAF. But at the same time, if you have queries, I'll happily assist your office in determining their status, and we'll get you the information that you require, James, as quickly as possible.
In your opening statement, Minister, you said that 40% of the ATIPs are not completed within the legally required time. Now, I appreciate that you said that you wouldn't make excuses, but I'll ask you a different question then. What percentage of unlawful delay would you consider acceptable?
I think that the standard is well set, and we work very hard to achieve it. I've acknowledged that with almost 38.27% of those not meeting that standard is unacceptable, and improvements must be made. I think we aim towards 100%. That's what the law requires.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And of course, your government, and you campaigned on a promise in 2015 to be the most open and transparent government in Canadian history. 8 years later, you are almost 40% of your ATIPs are unlawfully delayed.
They're not meeting the standard that is required, and I've talked about the steps that we are taking in order to work towards meeting that standard.
Back to Mr. Bazan's, some alarming information came out in his questions. Your report says that there are only 3 ATIPs that are more than 5 years old still outstanding. Mr. Matthews thought maybe the number was 5, and yet Mr. Bazan has 4 himself. So, we're left to wonder, how accurate is the report that you are publicly providing to Canadians about ATIPs? Are there in fact many more than just the 3 to 5 that may be outstanding? Or has Mr. Bazan been singled out for non-response to his ATIPs?
I'm not sure we have time or resources to single out Mr. Bazan. However, as I've already offered to him, if he provides me with the information on his requests, we will, first of all, determine their status and compare it against the existing data.
Okay, the information is public. These are ATIPs. This is not something that should require a televised committee hearing with the minister to sort out. These are old requests for access to information, just like any member of the public should be able to file.
Well, and I'm grateful that Mr. Bazan brought it to my attention this morning, because it's the first time I've learned that he had 4 outstanding ATIP requests. I have undertaken to him and this committee that I'll look at those to see their status.
When we say outstanding, we're just talking about the ones that have been outstanding since 2019 or earlier. There are a lot more than just 4, but these are the ones that are in an almost hopelessly delayed situation. Are you able to assure this committee and assure Canadians that these 4 ATIPs of Mr. Bazan's really are the only ATIPs from 2019 or earlier that your department has failed to process?
And again, as I've undertaken it, when Mr. Bazan presents me with that information, I'll compare it against our records and speak to the Deputy Minister. He's indicated that he's aware of 5. I haven't seen that data, but I'd like to see Mr. Bazan's reports, and we'll compare it against the data that exists.
So you're certain that there are no journalists, no academics, no researchers, no members of the public, no victims of sexual assault, no other members of the public that also may have outstanding ATIPs?
No, I've actually read, as Ms. Matheson shared with us, there are a number of journalists complaining about outstanding records as well. It's one of the reasons I've said in my opening remarks that I acknowledge that more work needs to be done, and we are working through the processes to improve our response to ATIP requests.
Okay. How else would you explain that of all of the thousands and thousands of people that file ATIPs, that an opposition member of Parliament seems to be the only one that has ATIPs that old that are outstanding?
I wouldn't want to speculate on what may have happened. It's one of the reasons I've invited Mr. Bazan to share that information with us. We'll get to the bottom of it.
All right, it's hard, well, I don't have very much time left, and,
That's true.
Well, then, I want to comment on, there's so much I could get to, but C-58, you mentioned it in your opening remarks, the Information Commissioner of the day called it a step backward. She called it one that actually took away some of the access to information that existed before 58. So it was more than just a broken promise. It was a reversed promise of the 2015 election. But your government, you mentioned the order-making powers. Your government is presently refusing to comply with an order of the Information Commissioner and taking the information to court. Is that openness and transparency at work?
I don't.
Would love to answer that question, and if he can do it in 15 seconds, we're happy to entertain that. Otherwise, I'll move on.
I don't believe that matter arises from my department, and I don't have any information on it, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you.
Have protocols being put in place to ensure all evidence is transferred to the investigating police force without exception or redactions when a sexual assault case is referred to the civilian courts?
What I have made clear is to the police, first of all these cases are to be transferred to the police of jurisdiction. But I will also tell you that in order to give that effect, I've been working very closely with Solicitor Generals right across the country, but here in particular in Ontario, in order to make sure that the police are able to conduct these investigations and receive that information very quickly and timely. There is a real challenge as we are moving through the legislation that I believe is required in order to change the way in which those investigations are now going to be conducted exclusively by the police of jurisdiction and the civilian policing system in our provinces, and as well prosecuted within the civilian justice system, that it is going to require legislative changes, and I hope to bring that forward.
And would you please provide the committee with a written outline of the protocol that will happen, because there are existing cases that are being transferred to the civilian courts, and they aren't getting the information that they know was put into evidence. Now, next, it's not just ATIPs, but grievances that are not responded to. So we have a situation where we have a whole squad or pod of women who had a senior officer come into their pod at night. That's what it's called in Saint Jean for basic training, and grope them from time to time. Now, this complaint was put forward by more than one woman, yet when one of the complainants went to the commanding officer, who was a female, and said, "We haven't received any reports on what's being done about this," the commanding officer said, "There have been no reports made." So they grieved up the process, still no response, and eventually the chief griever was thrown out of the military, or not thrown out, she kept on being failed in her nursing course, and then she saw the writing on the wall that she was never going to get through this endless loop, left the military, but worst of all, and all she wants after serving on and off for 10 years as a nurse was her veterans card. But that being said, why is it that the grievances aren't going forth and being acted upon?
First of all, can I tell you, I don't know the particulars of that case. However, the circumstances you describe are completely unacceptable. That's not merely a grievance, a work-related grievance, although it could form that grievance. That's one of the options that might be available to a member. But what you've described is a crime. And it needs to be dealt with more appropriately. It's one of the reasons we have undertaken to implement all of the recommendations of Madam Justice Arbour. It's one of the reasons in the next coming few weeks I'll be bringing forward legislation and coming back to this committee.
Right.
Those circumstances you described should never be dealt with that way, and no one should be left that unsupported. And so,
thank you. So on the part of transparency, we also have a number of soldiers who were training Iraqis in theater and who reported up the chain of command that they were being shown videos, and these weren't something they got off YouTube. These were actually given to the soldiers, shown as trophies that the perpetrators, they were required to train. Now, according to the laws of armed conflict, they're not supposed to be training terrorists or rapists, etc., into how to be more effective at their job. So they put a report in, sent it up the chain of command, but didn't receive any word back for years. Now we know that some of this is still going on because subsequent rotations are experiencing the same thing. What is the process reporting procedure? At what point does it get up to the Prime Minister's office? So it goes from the commanding officer in theater, from where to where to where until it gets to you?
And that was the matter that you refer, I believe, began in 2017, and that information, I don't believe, was entirely dealt with in an appropriate way in 2017. The matter was brought forward again for review in 2021, and at that time, the then Chief of Defense took a number of important actions to have the matter reviewed. There was also some orders issued by both the ministerial directive, and by the Chief of Defense to ensure that they're dealt with more appropriately in the future.
And when we're investigating sexual misconduct of generals, it's very difficult to find, especially when it reaches the highest general in the land, and was a matter, it came up for renewal of his term, not General Eyre, one of his predecessors. And at some point, the Prime Minister had to be officially told. At what point would you find out, as Minister, of an allegation at this level? And what would you do about it if and when you had such a report?
Very briefly,
what's the
please.
protocol?
Very briefly.
Again, you're dealing with a hypothetical. I do not have any information on what has transpired previously.
Yeah.
Information of misconduct needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with in a thorough way.
Thank you, Ms. Gallant.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead.
If I'm not here when this report is entitled, would you please call it not their first rodeo?
That's quite a point of order. You don't get those every day. Yes. Are you promised not to be here? But going back to something a little bit more serious than the entitlement of the report that has yet to be written. Ms. Gallant talked about a protocol in your first question, and was it clear to you what she was asking for? Because I frankly wasn't clear as to what she was asking for.
With respect to the allegation of sexual misconduct against a senior member of the service?
No.
Or with respect to the matter
the initial question, if we could clarify that?
Okay, so we learned over the weekend that the sexual assault cases aren't automatically going to go to civilian court as Justice Orber recommended, and that the government accepted all the recommendations for. So when the evidence is transferred from the military to the civilian courts, how are you going to ensure, what are the checks in the boxes that you're going to have to go through to make sure every aspect of the evidence that's required for that hearing, trial, et cetera, is transferred to the civilians?
Thank you for that clarification. I think that's a question that's of relevance to the committee. I hope that between you and Mr. Matthews that the leadership can respond to the protocol that she's asking for. Is that clear? Is that a reasonable request?
there is a responsibility for law enforcement that may have evidence in order to disclose it, and that information should be going to the police that will actually be responsible for the investigation, and therefore must also be disclosed in a fulsome way at any subsequent trial. Again, clarity is required here, and I believe that clarity is best achieved through legislative change in the National Defense Act. And we'll be talking more about that in the weeks to come.